first prediction concerns the evolution of the mobile network. And, I'm always chastened by the progress that mobile networks have made over the course of sort of predictions, and even sort of over the course of my career. So I started working in technology back in 1993 when 2G was about to arrive. And now we're at a point in the world where a gigabit per second to a phone is technically possible. And we are yet to awaken fully to all the commercial implications of those speeds. Now, in prior years, we've talked a lot about what's happening with 5G, and so the impact on the delivery of mobile standards, so what it enables. And this year, we're looking further into the network, specifically around the way in which the radio access network is procured, or the RAN, and then what that implies. What we are predicting is that there'll be a migration to the opening up of the RAN. And so basically, operators will be able to mix and match elements from each. And this is something which has started to happen, which should gather pace in this year and should accelerate, at least we can see until 23, 24, around that time. And an accompanying change that we expect will happen will be the virtualization of some of the network elements. So in the same way that there are lots of physical elements which can become virtual, in some regards, this meeting is an example of the way in which you can virtualize the elements. So within a telecoms network, that is part of the trend which is being expected. And that will itself enable much faster upgrades of capability and also fixes of issues. Now, the drivers for this, so this is where I think it's really interesting to consider what are the consequences for the people on the call. And so one of them is around the potential for cost savings for CapEx and OpEx. And in terms of what's been realized so far, there are very few examples, but in Japan, one of the operators, Rakuten, is seeing or claiming CapEx reductions of about 30% and OpEx of a similar amount. And one can argue, well, that's Japan. What about other countries? So in India, Jio is another company which is quite advanced with Open RAN, and they're looking to deploy this for their 5G network. So those are two quite different markets, but looking to apply Open RAN for a variety of reasons. And also what we're seeing is new vendors coming into the market. So I mentioned there are very few, effectively 4 or 5, depending on where you want to draw off the line. But there are now new vendors coming in specializing in individual elements of the RAN. So they don't have to be able to do everything, because with Open RAN, you can start blending supplies from different vendors. There's also greenfield operators coming in, so sometimes that's a condition of new of M&A happening in some markets. So if you think of the US, there is a new player coming in called Dish, and that's a consequence of the agreements made in the industry as a result of T-Mobile and Sprint merging. And so think of all the markets where you may get M&A leading to greenfield operators coming in. The likelihood is that they will look at Open RAN. In some markets, top right, there's been mandated to supply a swap out. Another change is what we're seeing is that there is more risk appetite amongst some of the new players, more willingness to experiment because there is no legacy out there in many regards, whether it's network or culture. There's also a move to towers companies, and what that is enabling is perhaps down the line for them to move up the value chain. Move on to the next topic, which is looking at a prediction of something we expect not to happen. So this is looking at 5G and its health impacts. And over the years, and particularly over the last 3 years, we always get questions around the impact of 5G on health. And I had that a couple of times when we were meeting with companies last year in South Africa. This also happened in other markets. I can think of meetings in the Middle East, in Central Europe, where people, and these would be sometimes board members at mobile operators, go, but 5G is bad for you, isn't it? And the reality is that the way in which mobile networks work is kind of confusing, in that it's very rarely explained, so it just happens. And mobile networks work in the same way, or in a similar way to TV broadcast, or even satellite broadcast, or radio broadcast, or walkie-talkies. So information is carried over radio waves, and there is some energy within there. So power is required to make those radio waves work. Now, the amount of power is absolutely tiny, but they're radio waves. Radio waves which are very intense could be used to cook food, so you've got microwaves. They could be used to tan skins, so that's what the sun does. They can also be used to see into bodies, that's X-rays, and they can be used for destruction, which is nuclear weapons. So there is a massive spectrum of possibility of what radio waves can do. In the same way that any tool could be used for benign and also destructive purposes. But the thing about 5G is the standard, or the way in which it's designed for communication, and it's designed very, very carefully so as not to cause any damage. Now, what we found when we were writing the prediction was it's very, very hard to find an accessible explanation of how mobile networks work. There are lots of scientific explanations of how mobile networks work, written for people who understand science. So there is definitely a cleft between those who understand and the mass market who would like to understand. And one of the big challenges society has to face is, how do you deal with misinformation? What is the impact of misinformation on society? Now, in terms of 5G, so the three issues that people worry about. First of all, it's 5G causes radiation sickness, which is what I referred to earlier. And that's kind of like a generation-old issue. So people worried about the launch of TV networks, or the propagation of TV towers. So TV towers, masts, radiate at about 100,000 watts at their peak. A COVID-related worry about 5G is because 5G rollout coincided with the spread of COVID, not exactly, but near enough. There's also been this perception that 5G weakens the immune system via the radio waves. And then a third rumor, which is impossible, is that COVID is spread via 5G towers, which is completely impossible, but it's plausible if you're not a scientist, if you're worried, if there are gaps in the knowledge which are out there. And people abhor vacuums of knowledge, and I think these are how these stories spread. So the last topic is staying on a topic related to or founded by connectivity, looking at what's happening with cloud. And cloud has been around for probably a couple of decades now, if we go from the very earliest days of cloud computing. And 10 years ago, it was growing at triple-digit rates. And most successful technologies grow very fast and then inexorably slow down. Cloud was slowing down and going through that maturity phase and going to double-digit growth, and it's re-accelerated. Partly this is because of what happened last year with companies having to move into the cloud, having to host Zoom meetings when beforehand they didn't. So that adds a lot of usage in there. There's also been a move to becoming more flexible. And also it's the case that cloud can be a part of a sort of a company's move towards net zero objectives. And I'll explain a bit more of that later. So in terms of overall trends, so what we're seeing is cloud spend is growing faster than overall IT spend. So what we're expecting for 2021 is $160 billion in revenues, so really significant revenues and a big jump from 2020. And we're expecting that kind of growth to continue through to 2025. And this has benefits from the supply chain into data centers, such as chip companies, which expect to generate $40 billion in revenues in 21 from selling to data centers versus 35 billion in 2020. Also, what we're expecting for this year is this year will be for enterprises the first year in which the majority of work processes take place in the cloud rather than on premise.